All right, welcome to episode 31 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we welcome back a very special guest, Mr. Keith Frankish. Welcome, welcome.
Hey Keith, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back.
So thank you so much for coming back on.
It's a pleasure.
So Keith, today we want to talk to our audience and obviously to Alan, for all of us, right, to share in kind of the understanding of what it is to be sort of implicitly and explicitly biased. So first of all, Keith, I wanted to ask you, what is the definition and what is the difference, the major differences between implicit and explicit biases?
Oh, well, that is itself is quite a complicated question. But let's just start simply. Let's take something like prejudice. You believe that people of a certain group, might be people of a certain ethnic group, it might be people of a certain gender or whatever it is, have certain characteristics that maybe they're smarter or less smart or whatever than other groups. Mm-hmm. You have these stereotype beliefs. Now, I guess explicit bias is when you're kind of aware of this and you let it control your behavior and your judgments about these people. And you're quite aware that this is happening. You say, no, I don't think we should let that person do it. Let's say might be a woman, say, I don't think women are as good at doing this as men, say. Mm-hmm. That would be explicit bias. And the advantage of that, of course, is that everybody can see what you're doing. And they can challenge you about it and confront you about it, and perhaps you could confront yourself about it. Now, implicit bias is something a lot more subtle. It's a kind of bias that sort of operates under the radar, as it were. You're not aware that you have it. Mm-hmm. But your behavior, the way you treat people, the judgments you make, the way you respond to people manifests it. So maybe you would say, absolutely, I don't think women are less qualified for this kind of job than men are. Absolutely, they're every bit as good. But still, when it maybe comes to hiring people or writing references for people, whatever it might be, you don't select the women as often as the men. You don't write as strong references for them, and so on. And this could show up in all kinds, in all aspects of your behavior. Perhaps in such things as how your posture when talking to someone. Do you seem more sort of like kind of keep a distance from them? Maybe I am not as inclined to confide in them or to trust them with simple things and so on. And the point about this is that it's implicit, that you're not aware of it. Mm-hmm. And the danger there, of course, is that and you might at the same time be saying, avowing quite the opposite beliefs. You might be saying, of course, women are as capable as men. And this is more of a problem in some ways because you're not aware of it and it's harder to confront it.
Yeah,
and harder to recognize it.
That's right. And then this conflict between our explicit biases and our implicit biases, or what we say explicitly and how we behave implicitly, it's interesting to see this conflict and how we sort of resolve this conflict. Because, for example, in the article that you shared with us, I did realize there was this a woman, I believe her name is Juliet, a fictional character, who is grading her class papers. And if asked explicitly what are her beliefs about the race, about the types of students in her class, she may say that she treats everyone equally. And this is her explicit response. However, maybe, and this is fictional, of course, hypothetical, in her grading of the papers, maybe she'll be more inclined to give a good grade to maybe the white student as opposed to the black student, even though explicitly she expresses that she does not feel that any sort of racial biases.
Right.
And that's why the article is important, because it's kind of highlighting this difference between this sort of explicit, what you would say explicitly, and how you actually behave implicitly. And then towards the end, how to
how to resolve that, how to override your implicit beliefs.
Right. And so just to add on, and I think I definitely want to kind of ask Keith about it as well, is that when it comes to particularly explicit and implicit beliefs, we technically believe those two conflicting things at the same time. And that we even behave in those two, or in the kind of ways that show or indicate that we have those two different sets of beliefs. So from my understanding of it, and Keith, of course, please correct me if I'm wrong, that somebody who has, like, let's say conflicting sets of implicit and explicit beliefs, that their behavior manifests in both ways. That sometimes they act in such a way where it indicates a sense of sort of racial and social justice. But then other times they can act in certain ways that indicate the opposite of that. Keith, is that correct?
Yes. I'll just mention that the Juliet example there is one that I quoted from a paper by Eric Schritz-Gable. So I'll just acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
Yes. And the way I came to thinking about implicit bias was by thinking more generally about the nature of belief, not in cases where the beliefs betray some kind of prejudice, but just in ordinary everyday cases. I started by thinking about, and this was when I was in grad school, certainly this was quite a big debate in the philosophy of mind. What are we actually doing when we say that somebody believes something or desires something? This is sometimes called folk psychology. It's the way we explain each other's behavior. We say, well, he wants this and he thinks that he can get it if he does that, and that's why he's doing it. And we just explain and predict people's behavior. Why did you expected me to be here to record this interview tonight, and because you knew that I believed that I'd agreed to it and that I wanted to do it, and so you put that together and predicted that I'd be here. And that seems the obvious way to predict and explain each other's behavior. And we can do it with animals too. But it seemed to me that when we talk about beliefs in everyday life, we mean two rather different sorts of things. And well, it's captured partly by talking about animals. By thinking about animal beliefs, when you say that my dog believes that it's that there's food has been put out for him, or that it's time for his walk, I'm not really suggesting that he's actually thought about this in some kind of explicit way, that he sort of said to himself, food, or walk time. He's just kind of reacting in that way. He's just displaying all the behavior that is sort of going for a walk behavior or getting food behavior. He's not actually sort of conceptualized this thought and said it to himself, or at least I'm not assuming he has. But we know that sometimes people do that kind of thing. They sort of consciously entertain certain thoughts and beliefs, and these affect their behavior, it seems. And so there seems to be a contrast here between something like this implicit kind of belief that just guides your behavior without you having to think about it, as it were, without having to entertain it consciously, and the sort of conscious, reflective sorts of beliefs that we humans certainly have. And so I started trying to think about what these are and how they're related to each other and how each of them influences action. I think they influence action in different ways. And that then led me into thinking about what happens when these two conflict, and you have, say, a belief, a conscious belief that is unbiased, that is egalitarian, and an implicit and a non-conscious belief that's biased. And the story that I came to is quite a complicated one. It's something like this: that the implicit belief and desire, these are the sort of foundations of the mind. These are kind of what get us around the world most of the time. We don't need to explicitly think about things in order to if you set out to go to the shops or something like this, or to go and catch a train, you don't need to think about all the steps involved. You kind of know what to do, and you just do it unreflectingly, assuming everything goes well. Guided by these kind of implicit beliefs and desires, it's knowledge that you have know-how, if you like, knowing how to engage with the world and to react to the world appropriately. And it just takes care of most things for us in a sort of animal way. But if you come up with some problem on your way, say, to the train station, if you find that the road is closed or something, then you might start to consciously think about alternatives and what you could do. And you might try and conjure up you might imagine a map of the city, or you might consult your phone or something, and consciously plan a different route, and then start acting on that. And so the idea is that this reflective kind of conscious belief kicks in when the implicit stuff isn't sufficient. We just default back to this automatic way of operating, and we engage in the conscious reflective stuff only when that lets us down. So how exactly does this conscious reflective stuff work? Is it like a completely separate sort of brain system? I mean, that seems a rather strange idea if you think that our minds are not all that different from those of animals. They're much more, our brains are larger and they're more powerful. But we are part of an evolutionary heritage, and it seems strange that in humans there should be some completely separate sort of reasoning system installed alongside the old systems that took care of animal behavior. And I don't think it requires something like that. I think what it requires is a certain sort of use of kind of tools that we have for thinking, particularly language. And so what we can do when we're stuck is we can start talking to ourselves. We can start asking ourselves questions. Sometimes not necessarily out loud. We can do it in a speech. Mm-hmm. When we find the road is closed, we can say, what other way could I go? As if we were talking to another person. And we can then respond to the things that we say to ourselves in much the same way that we might respond to suggestions from another person. So we might say, oh, this road is closed, where can I go? And, oh, I could take such and such a street. And then we can respond to that suggestion as a kind of prompt in the way that we might respond to a suggestion from another person. Once we've accepted that suggestion, as it were, we then switch back into automatic mode, and we know we're now taking the street and everything follows that way. So there it is. This is a kind of activity. Conscious thinking is a kind of activity. It's consciously articulating certain plans, proposals, ideas, goals, and then letting our implicit systems take those suggestions and act on them.
What's fascinating about that is if there's anything implicitly that you do that, let's say you wanted to change about yourself, realizing that talking to yourself and sort of having this sort of inner dialogue, or even the conscious will or motivation in order to kind of overcome, it doesn't always have to be about overcoming, but let's say in a context of overcoming a particular bias that you may have, mm-hmm. It's fascinating that there is a way to sort of take control. Whereas opposed, you might assign this to something that's automatic and something you have no control over. Mm-hmm. That actually is not the case. Mm-hmm. And Keith, I was wondering maybe if you could kind of talk about maybe how we could go about maybe overriding these implicit biases. Like, let's say, for example, let's say I have this habit of not eating a healthy diet, and I'm constantly choosing these things that are not good for me, and then of course explicitly, if I took into consideration what is a healthy diet and things of that nature, what's maybe something I can do, at least in that particular context. If you want to switch the context, we can do that as well. What could we do to maybe override those biases?
Well, that's the great question, and the important thing here is that you've got to remember that the implicit mind, the non-conscious processes, are the ones that are kind of doing all the work, even in cases where you're following explicit suggestions. So let's take the case of eating. Say you are just your habit is just to go and just eat whatever you feel like unreflectively. Mm-hmm. So you just take whatever's in front of you. And then let's say you begin to notice that this is having some adverse health consequences, and you start to reflect a bit on it, and you start to say, well, look, I should definitely start avoiding those things. Those very, those high-fat things or sugary things or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I should. So you reflect on this in this kind of dialogue that I was with oneself, and you say you come to a sort of decision. You say, okay, I'm going to avoid those. Now, what have you done there? Well, as I like to put it, you've sort of adopted a policy. Mm-hmm. You've made a sort of promise to yourself, I'm going to stick to this rule now of not eating those things and focusing on the other things. Now, how does that policy, how does it get actually implemented? How do you, as it, I've said I don't think there's some sort of separate system here, some separate brain system. Well, I think it gets implemented by the non-conscious mind, by the implicit mind, because we have a desire to stick to policies we've decided on. I mean, this is probably a desire. You could think about this as originating in social commitments. If you tell somebody that you're going to do something, then it's a good idea generally to stick to it. Otherwise, you'll get a lot of disapproval. So we make promises to each other first of all, and we get some pushback if we don't honour those promises. Then we can start making promises to ourselves. You see, in this kind of in a dialogue, and we say, okay, I'm going to promise myself I'm not going to eat that. And if that works, it works because at the implicit level, you have a desire now, not necessarily a desire not to eat those things. You probably still want to eat those unhealthy things at the implicit level, but you also have an implicit desire to stick to the policies you've committed yourself to honour your promises to yourself. And so now it's a question of which is going to be stronger. At the implicit level, your desire to eat the unhealthy food, or your desire to stick to your promise to yourself of not eating it. Mm-hmm. And it's which is stronger. And this is where I talk a bit about strength of will. I think strength of will really is the desire to stick to the. You see, it's a sort of the desire to stick to your promise is a sort of kind of higher level. It's still implicit, but it's a desire to control yourself in a certain way rather than to just act on your immediate impulses. Mm-hmm. So it's whether that desire to control yourself is stronger than the sort of first order desire to just go ahead and eat whatever you want. Mm-hmm. And I think there are things you can do to help cultivate that. I mean, the first thing you need to do is to keep the promise in mind. If you sort of make this promise to yourself and then just forget about it, well, that's not going to have any effect. So you need to keep reminding yourself of the promise, so that it's salient to you, especially when you're coming to opportunities to break it. So keep reminding yourself of it. Keep reminding yourself of what it requires of you, this particular thing. And then you need to sort of somehow strengthen your desire to act on it. And there are two sort of aspects there. One is you might have strengthened the desire to act on this particular promise, this desire to eat less, which you might do by reminding yourself of the benefits of eating less. So just keep thinking about why you want to eat less, why eat better, why it's good for you. Mm-hmm. And the other thing you might do is perhaps try to strengthen your strength of will in general, your general desire to be a self-controlled person, of which this is one particular instance. So you might say, look, I want to be the person. When I make myself a promise, I want to stick to it. It's important to my self-esteem, that I carry these things out. Just as it's important socially that people perceive me as someone who's reliable, mm-hmm. so that I do the things I promise, so that I perceive myself as a person who's reliable to myself. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, I don't have experimental evidence of this, but it seems to be plausible that thinking of yourself in that way, and perhaps making a point of perhaps making simple commitments, ones that are kind of easy to carry out, and making sure you do it is going to kind of reinforce this image of yourself as somebody who is self-controlled. So you might say, okay, maybe just today, I'm just going to stick to this policy of not eating that sort of thing. I'm not going to make the whole policy for that whole week or the whole month, but today, I'm just going to say today, and I'm going to make sure I stick to that. And then, having done that, you think, yeah, I did that. I controlled myself. I was, strong-willed about that. And then you can maybe sort of, move on to another step and say, I'm going to do it for a longer period or whatever it might be. But reinforce this image of yourself who does the things you promised yourself to do. Mm-hmm. And, of course, make them good things that you promised.
No, of course. Actually, what's fascinating about that is I had to think, you were mentioning having some sort of experimental evidence that supports what it is that you're saying. Mm-hmm. I would actually, thinking back in my own experience, I used to be obese. I used to be 300 pounds or 130 something kilograms, something like that. And for me, it's actually just as you say. I had to keep it in my working memory to stay true to my commitment. And there
Yep.
were, it's funny that you said to concentrate just on this particular day, whatever it is that task is to, because if I made it a long-term goal, in one sense I did, but in another sense, when I thought of it, like when I framed it that way, I had a harder time sort of committing to that goal because, it wasn't as strong as that implicit bias / desire that I had.
Yep.
When I did maintain that for that particular day, I would follow what it is that was my routine. That actually was enough to kind of overpower my what I would usually do, which is actually quite fascinating because this is a very interesting way of thinking about it. Because that then implies that, if you're going to maybe make a change, maybe decide, today I'm going to do something different because these things that you've been doing for a long time have such a weight around them that if you decided that you're going to forever maintain some sort of new habit, it's harder to do that than just this particular day.
A little bit at a time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And also, when you achieve those little goals, you'll get a good feeling from that. It will give you some positive reinforcement, which will then strengthen the desire to stick to other commitments, because you feel that, when I stick to these commitments, that makes me feel good. So the desire will increase to stick to them. As you're trying to, I don't know if this is a good metaphor, but think of a huge sort of ocean liner, and you can have the guy on the bridge saying, look, we want to change course, but that's got an awful lot of stuff that's got to happen below decks to make that happen. And you've got to have the people. You've got to have the people in the engine room or whatever. I'm not sure how this metaphor works, responding appropriately, and you've got to encourage them to respond appropriately. You've got to give them the right feedback to know that they're going to get rewarded if they do what the captain says. Mm-hmm. So you could just stand. So I think there's a danger that we make these kind of commitments kind of rashly, perhaps sometimes, and we perhaps overcommit ourselves. Things that are too big for us to achieve. And then we fail. Of course we fail, because we've got all this weight of the ocean liner going in one particular direction. You can't just turn it around like that. And we fail. And that makes the feeling of failure, that's unpleasant. And that, I think, affects our confidence the next time we try to make a commitment, and we're perhaps less willing to do it because we think, I'll probably fail again, and then I will feel bad again. So we're less willing to do it. You need to give yourself positive reinforcement on this. And you do that by realizing that just making a decision isn't enough. The decision has got to sort of, as it were, sink down to the implicit levels and start influencing that stuff and start being strong enough to make the changes that are needed to override the desires that maybe the attitudes that have been there for years and years, that are strong, that are automatic, that are, this strong automatic stuff, it's good. It's what gets you through the world. The trouble is, if we get bad things down there, it's hard to get them out. So you need to look at it strategically. Mm-hmm. How can I sort of manipulate my unconscious mind to get me where I want to be?
Yeah, and speaking of just automatic thoughts and automatic desires, just to kind of complement what you guys are talking about, what's so to me so fascinating is that a lot of times that people essentially think that they have their habits, but they also think that they are their thoughts in the sense of their beliefs. So something that I remember sort of all of us were talking about before the show was focusing on all of this and kind of implicit and explicit beliefs from a clinical perspective. And then so from a clinical perspective, kind of, and Keith, I definitely want to hear your ideas on this. So when kind of clients come to me, it's usually in the sense of like, they kind of feel pretty badly about themselves, and they sort of feel badly about their futures. They kind of feel badly about their potential, and they have this sort of implicit and even explicit belief, kind of these systems that tell them that they aren't good enough. And so a lot of times what we focus on is, or rather the sort of first question, or one of the first questions that they would ask is like, how is it even possible for me to change something like that? How can I just automatically just change my beliefs? I've had these beliefs since I was a child. These are not just something I can turn off. And I would say, yeah, absolutely. And so what I really like about the discussion that you guys were having was essentially that you can kind of change your habits, right, by being sort of more aware of them and being kind of more stronger in the sense of, or sort of feeling that you're more kind of willing rather to kind of let's say try or sort of shape or rechange your habits based on sort of more explicit values. And so the connection that I made with that in terms of kind of our just belief systems about ourselves or kind of the world around us is that essentially when it comes to kind of our beliefs and it comes to our values, that people essentially think of themselves as it's kind of, I guess, for lack of a better term, kind of slaves to their beliefs, and they think that there's no possible way to change them, just like they feel that they're kind of slaves to their behaviors. And so when it comes to behaviors, I mean, it's easier for people to understand that, okay, well, if I wanted to, or if I reminded myself that I needed to do, let's say, X today, right? I needed to do X today in order to feel better about myself. I can more easily do that than sort of believe that I'm something different, right? And so what I find is that it's actually very similar to decision making. So people are usually blown away by the idea that you can actually decide to believe something different. And so for them, they're like, whoa, what do you mean I could just decide? Like, how do I just do that, right? So it's definitely not that simple, but I kind of try to frame it to them in the sense or in the, so I use kind of two facets. I use science and I use logic. So when it comes to science, there are these two, well, it's technically connected. I don't want to,
of course,
right? I don't want to try to disconnect the two. So when it comes to science and it comes to logic, what we say is that, look, there are two kind of forms of scientists, right? There are scientists who are sort of more empirical, where they pretty much need 100% kind of concrete proof to believe in something. So a lot of times these people are the ones who are actually the deniers of, let's say, evolutionary theory, even probably climate change. They say, no, we need to actually see it physically in order to believe that it's true. So in this case, when it comes to logic, it's very black and white, that it's either I have clear evidence that something is true, some particular belief system, or it's that it's in complete sort of doubt or in disarray. So when it comes to kind of the right and people on the right sort of denying evolution or climate change, what they say is that, well, there's doubt, right? There's not 100% consensus, so very black and white. And so for my clients, right, a lot of times when they have these sort of really kind of core negative toxic beliefs, in order to challenge them, what they actually believe is that they need to have 100% proof, whatever that would even look like. So let's say if I believe I'm ugly, I need 100% of everybody to sort of think I'm attractive. One person can't think that. So for them, they think, well, there's no way for me to overcome that, right? Because that's how beliefs work. They're like, I just can't believe something just because, somebody said to me, counter or otherwise. And I say, yes. So here's the thing. If you're going to come at it or you're going to see it from a more empirical perspective where you're like, no, I need concrete evidence, I need to be 100% sure of it, then I said, yeah, of course, that's the choice that you're making. However, right, if you're sort of a scientist in the more kind of mainstream sense, where you're using abductive reasoning in the sense of coming to the best explanation possible, or I guess that's a good way of framing it. It's sort of the best explanation based on the data that we have, where we can say that, okay, let's say in the context of evolution, we know 95, maybe depends on if you ask, let's say Richard Dawkins will probably say 100%, even though it's not true. So let's say we have a 95% sort of certainty that evolution is true, right? And it's not so much that we have empirical data of it in the sense of we saw evolution occur over the sort of, the span of millions of years. We didn't. But we have enough data to make that inference and say that it's the best explanation possible. So what I try to tell my clients from a clinical standpoint is that you get to decide when is it enough evidence for you in order to change your beliefs. So we first kind of talk about the beliefs from a childhood from the standpoint of childhood, or from the perspective of, let's say, trauma in childhood. We say, well, these beliefs were implanted in you. So these implicit beliefs were pretty much, they were told to you by an authority figure who you respected and trusted, and they were pretty much reinforced over a long period of time. So as a kid, when you didn't have the ability to critically examine them, it was really easy for you to just simply accept them, to say, well, this is my mom, this is my dad, and if they're saying these things about me, of course they're going to be true. But the thing is, when you grow up and you develop kind of, hopefully somewhere down the line, the critical capacity to think and sort of form beliefs for yourself, you're the one who gets to decide when is it enough evidence for you to change a particular belief. So what I would say to them is like, look, for the people who are empiricists, sometimes I guess maybe it's possible for you to be 100% certain of something, but it's very rarely that that's ever the case. So when we talk about sort of these bigger theories, such as climate change or evolution, we don't mean that they're theories in the sense that they're just hypotheses, right? Because there's nuance there. So we don't mean that it's something that we just think based on the data it could be true. What we think is that because it is a theory, that it's highly likely to be true. So when it comes to abductive reasoning, what we mean is that we can take the information that, let's say, person X is getting from the environment, and then from that we can make certain inferences. So let's say if somebody were to think that they were stupid, we would say, okay, let's look at the evidence, right? So let's say X amount of people have given you all of this information, right? Let's say they believe that you were actually pretty knowledgeable and pretty insightful. And so then they would say something along the lines of, well, okay, but I mean, yeah, they said it, right? But like, what, I mean, other people haven't said that before. And I would say, okay, so let's say based on the evidence that you have, right? So in maybe another case, you would say that other people haven't given you that kind of feedback. But in this case, these particular people have. And I would ask, okay, so let's take context into consideration. So these particular people, what's their background, right? Like what is sort of the information that you're getting in terms of like what's their, I guess, level of sort of knowledge or insight or expertise. And a lot of times they would say, well, teachers have told me that. Let's say my principal told me that. My father, well, not in this case in terms of childhood trauma, not my father, but maybe friends have told me that, and friends have said, wow, like you're really insightful and you have all of this sort of plethora of knowledge and you always are there for me. Like I always come to you for advice, right? And so sometimes what they would do is they would automatically discount the information. They say, oh, well, that doesn't count because this person is my friend, right? And I would say, okay, I mean, now let's examine that. Is it possible that your friend, right, who doesn't particularly see you that way, is it possible they would continuously come to you for advice and you would see evidence of them using your advice? But so just not to kind of go on and on about this, my major point is that essentially when it comes to decision making, we can sort of, in terms of explicit and implicit decision making, we can kind of take a step back and ask ourselves, okay, what is it that I want to do to sort of move forward toward a particular goal? And then also when it comes to belief systems, we can ask ourselves, okay, how is it that I can decide for myself when I should and shouldn't believe a particular thing, right? What is the amount of evidence that I should accept, and when is it okay for me to sort of accept a belief, not knowing 100% that it's true, sort of saying that this belief is likely true or that this is the best explanation possible with the evidence that we have, but it's also possible that I could be wrong, although unlikely. But if I am wrong and if something were to contradict the information, that all I would do is simply change my belief, that it's not something I have to be kind of married to, right? That I don't need 100% certainty to believe X. Absolutely. Keith, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely, and I think that's absolutely right. What I would say though is, what happens then when they make this decision? Does it just sort of suppose they get to a point and they say, you're right, okay, I'm happy that, I can make this change, I can make this, revise my belief about myself or about climate change or whatever it might be. What happens then? Does it just kind of, delete the belief that was driving them before and kind of replace it with this new one? I don't think it works quite like that. And this is kind of where there's a problem, because you talked about habits there, and I think a lot of what I was talking about, implicit beliefs, are more like habits. They're ways of responding to the world. They're ways of responding to situations and to other people and so on, by saying things, reacting in certain ways. It's kind of it's not reflex, but it's very rapid. It doesn't require much thought, and it's something that's established, a pattern that's been established over long, and it's kind of worked for you. Maybe you picked up these beliefs because in the situations where you were, they kind of worked. I mean, if you're in a community where everybody believes something, and there's a lot of negative reaction to people who believe anything differently, it makes sense to believe it too, and to just react as they do, say the same things, dislike the same things, whatever. So these things are kind of part of the habits that get you around the world, and they're ingrained and tough for that reason, because they're doing a lot of the work. Now, suppose you reflect on this habit, the belief that it manifests, and you say, as you're just describing so well there, look, really, the evidence for it isn't strong, and the evidence for their side is really, strong enough to compel me to say, not perhaps to compel me, but to make it reasonable for me to say, no, it's the other thing. What happens then? Does this habit just get wiped out? No, it's been there for years. It's not going to be wiped out. But what you have now is you've done this attitude you've adopted in making this decision isn't another habit. Not yet. You want it to become a habit. You want it to gradually erase the old habit and replace it, but it isn't that yet. Not at all. It's more like a promise you've made to yourself. It's something. It's a commitment, an expression. It's saying that's what I want to be now. That's how I want in future to be reacting and responding to the world in that way. not in that other one. So, but so far it's just a kind of, it's a desire and a commitment to try and do it. But by no means is it there yet. And this is why if you're going to slip back, you're going to slip, like Juliet, she accepts after reflecting on the evidence that there's no racial differences in intelligence. Of course there aren't. I mean, again, you might say, well, it's not 100% true, but it's overwhelming, and so, but still she slips back into these old ways when she's not really paying attention to what she's doing, when she forgets the commitment or forgets to make the commitment effective. So this is what you've got a task. It's no good at just making the change of mind and thinking, that's it, I've done it. No, you've just started. You've now got to monitor yourself. You've got to watch yourself. You've got to look for occasions where this commitment is relevant and start trying, perhaps quite effortlessly at first, to regulate your behavior in line with it. And that's going to initially be hard because you've got this huge pre-existing habit that's pushing in the other direction. And you've got to try to resist that. It's like, I mean, here's an example. Like, you're driving the car and the indicator stalk on your car is on one side, I'll say it's on the right. And you've driven this car for years, okay? And you just, when you want to make an turn, your hand just goes to it automatically. You get a new car and the indicator stalk's on the other side. Now, you sit in the car and immediately you say, the indicator stalk's on the other side. Okay, I'm going to have to move my left hand right, my right hand. No problem, I can do that. But it takes you, so you've made the kind of commitment to saying use left hand rather than the right hand. But it takes you days, weeks, months before it finally sort of becomes a habit, before the sort of the old implicit belief that it's on the right gets erased, if you like. And that's like you with your implicit, with your own habits, your own mind. You've got to work at changing them.
Yeah, there's a certain that's right. There's a certain momentum to these ingrained habits that you have. That's why these new behaviors that you're trying, you have to keep your commitment to them. In the case of Juliet, while she's grading, she may explicitly understand, that there is no difference in race. When she's grading her paper, she kind of, without constantly using her working memory to keep this commitment to her explicit belief, she keeps falling back into her implicit bias. So I suppose using that as an example, you'd have to just keep it in your working memory and let that have its own momentum in order to override these prior ingrained beliefs or / habits. Right?
Yeah.
Yes. So you've got to keep reminding yourself.
Oh, and I just kind of wanted to really share quickly with you guys a kind of personal story of how sort of what worked for me. And definitely want to hear your feedback on it. So for me, so when it comes, this is kind of, I guess, a personal thought. So for a very long time, I was a pretty judgmental person. I mean, it was sort of very easy for me to very quickly sort of judge people in a very harsh way and kind of be hard, because I was hard on myself and I was also hard on other people. So what to me was very helpful about that was, so psychologically speaking, I mean, so we kind of known that sort of self-criticism, or rather other criticism of other people, is a reflection of the self. So that was definitely partially helpful to me, but in terms of what you guys are talking about, this is why this idea came to me, is that commitment was also very important to me. So in terms of, so this is what helped to me. So I have a college mentor. His name is Dr. Timothy Stroop. So he's an ethicist, and so he's a person in my life who's been super influential. And so one thing that he once told me was that he said, what impressed me the most about you was your ability to sort of be kind of married to reason and to truth. That he said no matter kind of where you went, like truth was really important to you, and that you were committed to it regardless of how it made you feel. So to some extent that was true, but not to the extent of my of eliminating kind of my ability to sort of judge, or my, I guess, willingness rather to kind of not explicitly to automatically judge other people. So in a sense, he was sort of partially right. So what he was saying is that my commitment to truth in an academic sense was absolutely true, but my commitment to truth in an interpersonal sense was not. And that's, I think, a part of me that he didn't know at the time. And then so for me, I remember I sat there and I kind of thought about it, and I said, wow, so am I really committed to truth? Or like, am I kind of sometimes being an asshole and sort of being obviously, just false when I make these quick assertions of other people and their experiences and why they're doing the things that they're doing? And then so what really helped me was when I kind of sat back and thought about it, and I said, what I really want is to live up to his expectation, right? To whatever degree that's possible. So academically, I was like, okay, I mean, academically, I could say fairly, I could pretty much keep an open mind. So not fully, obviously, there's some things, I don't want to be sort of too arrogant arrogant about it. But like I'm pretty decent when it comes to sort of textbook stuff. But then when it came to people, I felt like I was actually pretty shut off and I was closed-minded. So whenever somebody did something, I automatically believed that I knew the answer as to why, and I blamed them for it. I was very harsh in my assessment. And so I remember thinking about it, and I said, wow, you know what? This guy means so much to me, and he was like a father figure in my life, and I really want to live up to the way that he sees me. So the way that I sort of looked at it was, okay, I said, in order to sort of assess my beliefs, or in order to kind of make sure that I have the most accurate representation possible, my commitment was to sort of to be in to live up to that ideal, his ideal, or his perception of me in his best way as possible. So whenever I would kind of start looking back, or whenever I even going forward, whenever I found myself judging someone, I was asking myself, okay, am I actually living up to my ideal at that point? Am I being committed to truth? Am I committed to sort of understanding this person's experience, to seeing reality as it actually is? Or am I sort of more committed to holding on to my implicit belief of my sort of automatic thought of what I think that person's experience is? And so in that case, when I would kind of go back, I would say, no, I am committed to sort of living up to this perception of myself, and this perception that I have of myself, and also this perception that my mentor has of me. So when I would kind of take a step back, I would consistently ask myself, maybe not always, definitely not always, but good
as much as you could,
as much as I wanted to. I would say, as much as I wanted to, I would sort of look back and I would say, okay, am I really committed to sort of understanding not just this person, but understanding reality? Am I really committed to truth, or am I more committed to just accepting the belief that I initially had? So what helped me in terms of forming a particular commitment was sort of reminding myself that this person has this view of me, and I don't want to let him down. I don't want to sort of lie to him. Even if I didn't explicitly tell him that I want you, or I am this way. I just felt like for me it was important for him to see me that way. And so the commitment in a sense was the commitment to truth, yes, but it was also a commitment to making sure that this person has an accurate representation of me. Wow. So, yeah.
I think that's great, and I think that really provides a great illustration of what I was trying to talk about earlier, which was that when you make these promises to yourself, there might be epistemic commitments to truth, or there might be commitments to particular kinds of activity, like eating better. It's one thing to make the commitment, it's another to act on it. You need to have a strong implicit desire to act on that commitment, which is strong enough to make you act on the commitment rather than the first order desire to do something else, or the first order belief in something else. And you asked me, how could you sort of strengthen that? Well, that's a great way, having some kind of exemplar, some ideal, some person who you want to, whose vision of you want to live up to. I think that's a terrific way. And I think this is quite important. That, I mean, I don't want to sound too idealistic and naive, but I think when dealing with people who, or say communities that have views that we think are reprehensible, that are reprehensible, there's a great tendency to just go in for sort of condemnation of the views and just say, that's wrong, that's unfair, that's horrible, that's, whatever. I think we need to do something a bit more than that. We need to try and provide them with a kind of, the motivation, not just to change that view, but then to sort of live up to a higher ideal of themselves that would be in line with this. And so this is why I think it requires more than just confronting the views. You need to provide them with a kind of community, with an exemplar like that, with somebody like that, who has a vision of them that is better than the one that they're currently. And so, I mean, this may sound naive, and people might rightly say, look, there's some people's views are so objectionable that we shouldn't engage with them. But I think for a lot of people, I think it's changing hearts as well as minds. And just confronting the views is not enough. You need to give them the strength of will, the vision of themselves that will help them to not just to make to change their views, but then to act on those changed views and make them their new self. So I think having ideals like that is incredibly important. I think we're not a very kind of idealistic culture at the moment. We seem to be a rather cynical culture. We seem to not expect a lot of each other and of a society. And I'm generalizing wildly here, and I know it's silly, but and it's difficult, of course, to have ideals because we know that, people have feet of clay, and we know that, you have some person who you've maybe, idolized, and then you find out that there's all kinds of problems with them and so on. And it's hard to maintain this idealism, but I think that's one way in which we can help ourselves. The way to help yourself be the person you want to be is to engage with someone who wants you to be that way, who sees you that way, who has that vision of you, like your mentor. And we need to do this for each other, I think. It's too much to expect people to create it for themselves, to create that vision of themselves for themselves. They need to see it in other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm becoming
No, I agree with you. There should be some sort of systematic approach that we sort of have in our culture that kind of would allow for this sort of change to occur. The thing is, things are so, how should I put this? Like, things occur quite randomly, right? Somewhat arbitrarily sometimes. And without a structure, some people will make it. Some people will happen upon great mentors. They'll be able to change in a direction that they see as beneficial towards themselves. Maybe contribute to other people. But then there's going to be other people who, due to the arbitrary, circumstances, may just not be so lucky. May not even know that they can override their implicit biases, for example, or who are aware that there can be metacognition, like you can be aware of your thinking, or projection, or things of that nature, among other things, etc., etc., etc. So Keith, definitely I'm with you 100%. There should be something. For instance, I mean, that's kind of like why I like podcasts, for instance. It doesn't have to necessarily even be this particular podcast, although very well may be. Yeah. There are other ones as well, right? And there are people who, depending on how the audience resonates with who's on the show or who's speaking, that for them may be that particular mentor. For instance, the way that you're framing things, Keith, honestly, I like it, especially having read your article. It actually, if you really digest the article, you really can, from it, kind of develop your own method of how to sort of change your own implicit biases. I could definitely see, like, for instance, you highlighted 4 ways. Forgive me that I wouldn't be able to mention all of them at this particular moment, but for instance, keeping your commitment in your working memory plus the motivation to sort of, to keep going with your endeavor. It's interesting because you also highlight what are the pitfalls to it, how to kind of how to sort of also successfully do it, kind of how to look out for it. So I think it's interesting how you framed it in your article, because I feel like almost prepared for any sort of circumstance while trying to undertake that endeavor. So I think that's like a good resource, for example, to consult if you're attempting to, override something that you implicitly do with some sort of implicit bias. So that's just one.
Well, thanks. That's very kind of. I should say that that article is in a book in a collection, but there is a free e-print of it on my website, or my own version of it. So you don't have to buy the book to read the article. If you, let's just mention something here. There is a sort of dark side to all this as well, I think, because there's a danger that you can start doing this same process in a negative way. You can start committing yourself to bad views, bad views of yourself. You can start making these promises to yourself. It's perhaps inappropriate to talk about those promises, but you can sort of adopt these views of yourself. You can adopt negative views that you cannot do these things, that you are a bad person or an unlikable person, ugly person, or whatever it is, and you start making that as the commitment to yourself, and then you start working on ingraining that as a habit. Doing and I think that there are certain situations that, if people have low self-esteem, if they've got bad social relations, that can induce people to do this. And we need to be very careful to avoid doing that. And I think we all have a tendency to do it. The thing is, we tend to live up to the picture of ourselves that we present to ourselves. And so we're going to be very careful in shaping that picture and shaping it positively. You see, in a sense, this is the sort of great thing about being human, is that for animals, I think the animals are just creatures. I don't mean to. This isn't to sort of just sort of dismiss animals, non-human animals. I mean, I love animals, but I think they're largely creatures of habit. Their reactions to the world are shaped by their experience, and they're kind of the prisoner of that. They can't do this thing of stepping out and reflecting on the habits they have, on the way they react to the world. They can't do this metacognitive thing. They can't sit back and say, look, I always have this thing where, I don't know, when the food comes out, where I rush out and gobble it down. But really, I shouldn't do that. I should space it out so there's more for me later on. I mean, maybe some of the higher apes have something like this. I don't know, but the great apes have something like this. But we can do this. We can sort of we can sort of construct for ourselves this other kind of mind, this mind of self-questioning, self-reflection, self-commitment, and this is what I think makes us just different from the other animals. That we can create this new kind of level of mental activity which allows us to shape the other more animal level and to change our own habits, to take new courses. Now, that's both the sort of blessing and the curse of being human. It's a blessing because we can shape ourselves in good direction. It's a curse because we can shape ourselves in bad directions. And understanding the mechanisms of this, how it happens, why it's important, how you can cultivate it in one way or another, I think this is incredibly important. And understanding both the powers of this and the limits of it. Mm-hmm. We can't just sort of say to ourselves, right, I'm going to change now and everything's going to be different. It doesn't work. You're going to fail and feel depressed. But equally, it's not the case that you can't do anything about it, that you're the prisoner of your habits. You can do things. Mm-hmm. And you need to reflect on where you want to go and how you're going to get there. And this is really distinctively human existence, I think.
And so, Keith, I wanted to read an excerpt from one of your articles on Aeon, so the one about self-deception, which I thought was really, really important, and I had a question about it. So you wrote...
Oh, great.
Okay, so the quote is, studies show that people who sincerely say that racial stereotypes are false often continue to behave as if they are true when not paying attention to what they are doing. Such behavior is usually said to manifest an implicit bias, which conflicts with the person's explicit beliefs. But the ISA theory offers a simpler explanation. People think that the stereotypes are true, but also say that it is not acceptable to admit this, and therefore say that they are false. Moreover, they say to themselves too in inner speech and mistakenly interpret themselves as believing it. So, Keith, I wanted to ask you, first of all, what is ISA theory, and how come within the theory we sort of reinterpret implicit and explicit bias?
Right. Oh, big question. So, ISA, that is interpretative sensory access, I think. This is it's a term coined by the philosopher Peter Carruthers, who's a professor of philosophy at Maryland, and was my PhD supervisor.
Oh, that's really cool.
A huge influence on me, and a very, very good philosopher of mine. One of the leading contemporary philosophers of mine. That's this theory is one that he sets out in a book, I think it's 2011, called The Opacity of Mind. It's about self-knowledge, about the limits of self-knowledge. And he thinks that our knowledge of our own minds is very limited indeed, particularly with regard to belief and desire. He thinks that it's the sort of picture that I've been sketching of the implicit mind. He thinks that beliefs and desires are really all kind of operate at a non-conscious level. And we have no immediate access to them. You can't just sort of look into, as it were, into this sort of mechanism that is controlling your behavior and just see what beliefs and desires you have in there. No, they're there. They're parts of the system, and they are controlling your action. Your beliefs about your own beliefs are the product of self-interpretation. So you have to interpret yourself. What do I believe? Well, here's how I behave, and here's what I say, and here's what I think, and so here's the things that come to mind. So that's what I believe. Take the case, but we don't always get this right. Take the case of Juliet. She believes that black people are less intelligent than white people. That is what she believes. That's the guiding belief behind most of her action. And that's what she believes. And if she reflects on it a little bit, she'll see. If she interprets herself, that's what she believes. And her belief that, now this is Peter's way of telling the story, she falsely believes that she doesn't believe that. She also seems to have this explicit belief that there are no racial differences in intelligence. She seems to have this correct egalitarian belief that there are no differences. Mm-hmm. She doesn't really have that belief, according to Peter. The thing that's driving her behavior is the biased belief. Mm-hmm. What she does is she tells herself that she believes that. Mm-hmm. She falsely thinks that she believes the unbiased belief. Mm-hmm. It's a piece of bad self-interpretation. Mm-hmm. Whereas if she scrutinizes it, so she perhaps believes that because she remembers reading this article that said, the science shows there are absolutely no differences, no racial difference in intelligence, and she thought, yeah, that seems plausible to me, that's okay, that's what I believe, and she remembers that, and she thinks, that's what I believe. She hasn't sufficiently noticed, observed, and interpreted her own behavior. So she has a belief that there are racial differences in intelligence, and a false belief that she believes there aren't. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, what I was getting at in that paper. Now, I think that's too pessimistic in a way, because I don't think these explicit beliefs are just sort of bits of self-interpretation. I think they can be more than that. They can be, as we've been talking about, commitments. Mm-hmm. So Juliet didn't just say, I think I believe that there are no racial differences in intelligence. That's how I interpret myself, and I'm happy with that, and go on. Yeah. She can commit to that, to living up to it. Mm-hmm. But then she does need to be quite reflective. She does need to watch her behavior. She does need to be open to the possibility that merely having said it doesn't necessarily make it true. This is the thing. I mean, we are great self-deceivers. We tell ourselves that we believe something, mm-hmm. something, that we're good people, that we're fair, that we don't have any of these bias beliefs. But we don't really perhaps monitor ourselves and check that we are actually manifesting those beliefs and desires in our behavior. And if we're not, we need to do something to this process we've been talking about of shaping ourselves to the vision we have of ourselves. So I don't agree with Peter that it's just a matter of self-interpretation. It can be also self-creation, mm-hmm. self-shaping in line with this. So, it may start as self-interpretation. It may start as it may start as a false belief that you believe that there are no racial differences, but then you can make it true.
Right. And so the thought that I had, or the question that I had was, I guess, is it possible for both of those things to be true? Where on the one hand, let's say Juliet would act as though she believed that there were these big racial or important racial differences. And then on the other hand, when she was thinking about it more explicitly, accepting the contrary belief, that she was acting in line with that value. Or either that belief.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, absolutely. This is why you get these conflicts of behavior. Mm-hmm. You have a commitment that is in conflict with the implicit belief that is driving your behavior. But my difference with Peter, I think, is that for him, this explicit stuff is just a sort of self-presentation, a sort of self-belief, whereas I think it can be more like a self-commitment that actually has real effects. I mean, he wouldn't deny that, but he wouldn't deny that it can have effects, but he wouldn't call it a belief. He wouldn't call the explicit thing a belief in the opposite proposition, in the idea that there are no racial differences. But yes, we can absolutely have this conflict, and this is very important, and that sometimes you're being, as it were, guided by your higher self, as it were, and sometimes by your lower self, and it's important to recognize these things.
Yeah. And do you think that shame or a sense of guilt can be a motivator for, let's say, not necessarily changing the belief, because I think the belief or the belief change would be so related rather to, or the foundation for a sense of shame or guilt. But do you think that sense of shame or guilt, that sense of shame, or both possibly, the sense of shame and guilt can be the foundation for sort of being more motivated or more committed to acting in the context of your, I guess, whatever, in light of your new belief, or in light of this sort of altered belief?
Absolutely, shame and belief incredibly powerful, of course, and then they are socially they're social emotions, and of course they themselves can be both positive and negative depending on the sort of community that you're in. Mm-hmm. Shame can be used to induce people to do and believe all kinds of terrible things, but it's incredibly powerful motivator, yes, and the sense of self-internalizing this, a sense that you're not living up to to your own ideals. Yes, mm-hmm. Though again, I think in all of these things, people need to be kind of gentle with themselves and realizing that in trying to, this sort of reshaping that I'm talking about, it's got to be done gradually. If you're going to set yourself a very ambitious goal and then feel ashamed of yourself for not meeting it, then that's going to be counterproductive. Because shame is a very negative emotion. You need to set yourself a modest goal that you can reach and then feel good about yourself. And that will reinforce it and enable you to go a bit further next time. So, I mean, shame is certainly powerful, but I think it's got to be, used with caution, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the way I try to kind of conceptualize this is that from my understanding of it is there's a huge difference between a pretty big gap between shame and guilt. So shame is based on an assessment of your character on the whole, to say something along the lines of I'm a bad person, I'm a terrible person, I'm worthless, whatever, etc. But then guilt is particularly connected to the behaviors or the actions, to say I feel guilty because I did this particular thing. So when it comes to shame, there's really nothing that you can do with that because this is a part of who you are. So a person would tend to think that it's either impossible to change or it's very unlikely. So when we come at it from that standpoint, what happens is a person tends to feel overwhelmed and just might even deny it altogether and say, no, I'm not that bad person, right? Or sort of deny being racist or just deny doing any of those things that indicate poor values or poor beliefs, rather. But when it comes to guilt, it's much easier because we're saying that here are these particular behaviors, right? And these behaviors are behaviors that you've done based on this reason, but now that you have a different set of beliefs, that now you can sort of act differently. So yes, you should feel guilty about it, and that's okay because all of us feel guilty about things that we've done, but now that you should use that guilt as a motivator to change. Now that it's possible, knowing that it doesn't define you as a sort of as a whole, and it doesn't indicate a broad conception of who you are as a human being.
Yeah, I agree totally. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think perhaps what I said there could perhaps have been better cast in terms of guilt rather than shame. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
No, of course, you want to move away from things that are painful or things that are terribly uncomfortable. So if for some reason you associate guilt or shame with a particular behavior or something or an activity that you do, I can see that being a powerful motivator. But I agree with Keith that maybe setting your eyes towards another emotion, a more modest sort of goal, maybe being instead of being pushed away from something by guilt or shame, maybe being pulled towards something with some sort of excitement or enthusiasm or something that can kind of push you to keep trying new things. But it depends. I believe it's context dependent. So I'm sure it could work, shame or guilt. You would just think it's not the ideal. At least on the surface.
It could also be both. I'm thinking that even if, let's say, so guilt maybe doesn't necessarily have to be the only motivator. So one of the other motivators could be just to sort of self, kind of actualization, right? I want to become the best version of myself, but then also on top of that, I feel guilty.
So, see, nuance like that is what alters. See, that's why I said on the surface. So, fair enough.
Most definitely.
Of course,
All right. Go ahead, Keith.
I think the danger. Sorry, I just think the danger with shame. I think, particularly if you're trying to shame people out of reprehensible beliefs, is that shame is so painful that people just don't want to confront it, and they just close down. They just put up the barriers in some way and just refuse to face it. Whereas offering a more positive and optimistic vision of themselves is perhaps a better way to get them to be self-critical. If they see that maybe change these attitudes, and you're going to be more like somebody they admire or someone or whatever. I think it's carrot and stick, I suppose, but I tend to think that focus just on making people feel bad about themselves isn't necessarily the best way to get them to adopt a better vision.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, so I want to say something that my hope is, so I was thinking this, and I just hope it's not sort of misinterpreted by the people who listen to it, but in terms of, and so I'm going to try to be as clear about this idea as possible. So as a kind of culture, right, we're very sort of, we're very quick to shame people for, let's say, either acting in a way that's sexist or acting in a way that's racist. And so unfortunately what happens is, so look, sometimes it works. Sometimes the person, if you can convince them through shame, through the use of shame, it's a great thing. So the problem is statistically it doesn't, because what happens is when you call a person sexist or racist, they automatically defend themselves. They say, no, I'm not any of those things. Or sometimes even conversely, they would say, yeah, I am, but that's how life is supposed to be. So they sort of double down on it. And so the way I kind of conceive of it is from the standpoint of guilt and empathy. And so in this case, what you would do, or what I find to be helpful, and again, my hope is that this is not misinterpreted, is to say that, look, I understand based on the environment why you have these particular implicit biases. That you grew up in a highly racist culture, you grew up in a highly sexist culture, right? Which, by the way, I did, right? So for me, it sort of took a lot to understand why kind of I believed certain things that I believed when I was younger. And so it's pretty much inevitable because you are your environment. It's very hard for somebody just to kind of turn that off or to say, no, I'm going to have these different beliefs or these different values. And so what I find to be most helpful is when you sort of first, you would tell the person, well, first you would try to kind of use logic and reason to convince them that it doesn't make sense for you to be or believe these things, because we know kind of from evidence that obviously women and kind of and let's say people who are in different sort of ethnic categories, they're not in any inherent sort of way inferior to people, Caucasian men especially, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? So if you can sort of work at it from that perspective, from kind of logic, reason, and evidence, and then on the other hand to say, no, but look, I also understand why you believe the things that you believe. They're wrong, this is why they're wrong, but you shouldn't be ashamed of them, right? Because these beliefs were in the sort of milieu of this particular context, right? So then the next question is, okay, so what do you do with that, right? So then if it's not shame, how do you get the person to change? And then you would say, okay, so here are the behaviors that you've sort of enacted, and this is the way you've treated people based on those implicit beliefs, right? You shouldn't be ashamed of yourself as a human being because they make a lot of sense in the context. But going forward, if you were to continue to behave this way, or even kind of looking back, well, not looking back on it, let's say going forward, because now you have this sort of new sort of evidence and new information. If you were to continue to act in this way, you should feel guilty about it, because now kind of as we've gone through the evidence, and if this person has accepted the evidence, this isn't the right way to treat somebody because you know it isn't, right? Based on the information that we've just talked about. So more so than shaming a person for being racist and sexist, which kind of we know from the data isn't very effective, I think it's much better to sort of try to first understand why they are the way they are and try to sort of empathize with them and explain to them that we understand why is it that you believe certain things that you believe, and then also from the other perspective to say that, yeah, now that, we've kind of examined it and that, some part of you has accepted this as being factual, that we have to say that you should feel guilty about your behavior going forward if you were to act on that old belief system. Right?
Yeah.
But then also kind of, again, from empathy, understanding that, look, you're not going to change overnight. And we understand you're going to make some mistakes, but we also want to help you feel guilty about them. And we want you to sort of correct them and correct course. And to say that, no, if you do make that mistake and if you do act in such a way which is founded in racism or sexism, you should go back and apologize or make amends, right? Because we understand that automatic habits and beliefs don't just change overnight, and you're not just going to become a different person, right? But you have to sort of now work toward behaving like you believe these new beliefs, right? You have to behave in such a way where the indication is that, no, he believes sort of in a more equality or in a more egalitarian kind of, or has a more egalitarian perspective.
I don't think you're going to be misunderstood.
I hope not. I hope not. That's why I was afraid of saying it, because I know kind of we're very quick to shame people, and it's not effective. Keith,
but absolutely, the effectiveness is the important thing, because you need this person. It's one thing to have sort of a kind of a confrontation with somebody and explain why they're wrong, and perhaps even get them to admit that they're wrong. But that hasn't changed anything much. It's a long process after that of getting them to reshape their habits in line with this new attitude, and they need to be doing that. In the end, the only person who can change your mind is yourself, because somebody else might convince you, right? Okay, I accept that. But that's not the end of it. There's this process of self-shaping to this new ideal, and you've got to do that yourself. You've got to keep regulating yourself, watching yourself. And if that process is entirely supposed to be motivated entirely by guilt and shame or whatever, the attitudes, people are not going to be kind of so highly motivated to do it. They're not going to be trying to keep these attitudes in mind that they've been made to feel, that they have such negative feelings about. They need to be motivated by a positive vision of how they can be better, of why this is something they want to do to reshape themselves in this better direction. So this is why things like finding some role model or something like that, or someone who they can hold in mind as I want to live up to that guy's vision of me. I think that's a much more powerful way of getting them to do the self-shaping than to just have this very negative picture of themselves that they're trying to escape from. Because even though they're trying to escape from it, they still have to entertain that thing as the motivator, you see. And so entertaining that is not very pleasant. Again, it needs to be a combination, but I think we need to sort of have like communities that can I mean, I suppose this is something that the church used to do in a way, that churches used to do, that they used to sort of offer people who'd kind of converted an incredibly supportive atmosphere. And it was like, you know, you may be a sinner or whatever, but your sins are forgiven, and you're now part of this wonderful community, and we're going to support you every step of the way. And they had this way of distancing the sinner from the sin and so on, which just psychologically is quite a useful thing, because they can say, yes, you have this bad thing about you, this sin, and that's really, really bad, and you feel bad about it, but it's not you, it doesn't define you. We've got a better vision of you, and here you can follow that. Right. And maybe, I guess we need some sort of secular vision of that can combine the awareness of the thing that needs to be eradicated with the vision of the person as someone who's not defined by it.
Wow, it's to say that you are redeemable, and that's a really brilliant idea from Christian thought.
Which is what, in a sense, that's what we all want. In a sense, we're all sort of so aware of our failings, of the things that we've the people we've let down, the projects we haven't fulfilled, the way that we haven't lived out. And we all want this idea of a better vision of ourselves. We all want redemption. So, and that's psychologically Christianity. I mean, another religion too. I'm not just being that. Makes a lot of sense. It offers a kind of route to this kind of self-shaping, I think, and a mechanism for it that is quite effective.
And if it's all right with you guys, I want to actually go back for, I mean, not a moment, I guess, this is going to kind of be a bigger shift. Go back to decision making, because I had a question for you, Keith. Okay, so in your article, in the Aeon article, you wrote, our beliefs about our own thoughts and decisions are the product of self-interpretation and are often mistaken. And so when I read this, I was wondering, what is sort of your understanding of, and I'm sure you probably know this way better than we do, on the results of Benjamin Libet and sort of the neuropsychological studies that pretty much show that it's sort of pre-consciousness that brings about decisions, and then later on we interpret our decisions, or rather we interpret why we made the decisions that we made. So essentially the kind of neuroscientific argument is, not for everybody, but from a lot of sort of perspectives, is that essentially that we don't actually make decisions in the moment, that we actually are sort of pre-consciousness, or our brains essentially make our decisions for us, and then we kind of interpret them, and we kind of create the reasons why.
Backwards rationalization.
There it is, backwards rationalization. So essentially we kind of make up reasons why we decide what we decide, without actually having those reasons be the reasons necessarily in the kind of initial moments of making those decisions. So Keith, I wanted to ask, is it possible then to ever make a decision consciously, or is it that we are sort of subject to our brain chemistry in a sense?
I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly the sort of confabulation does happen. There's no doubt about that. Though, of course, in a lot of cases, I think, the sort of the non-conscious processes that are initiating it are consonant with the interpretation that we consciously attach to it. We're kind of right about ourselves. We know ourselves pretty well. And it's a big mistake here, I think, to think of like my brain chose this before I did. Your brain is, your brain deciding it. It's you doing it. Okay, maybe you doing it without conscious awareness, but that's still you, because you are this reactive creature. Look, if I have a bunch of attitudes that lead me to just behave in a certain way as I wander around the world, they are me. That's me acting. Indeed, often the things that we pride ourselves most on are the things that we don't do consciously. Think about somebody who is, say, an expert musician. They're not thinking consciously about every move they make. It's the fact that they're so skilled they don't need to. It's a talent they've developed, a way of engaging with the piano and producing this wonderful music, and it's them. They are the people. They are the one playing the piano, but they're not. It's not their conscious mind that's entertaining every the movement of their fingers and so on, planning it and so on. They practice so they didn't need to do that. Or a sports player. Or indeed, as we're speaking to each other now, we're not consciously pre-planning every word we speak.
That's right.
If I tried to do that, I would be even more incoherent than I am.
That's true.
We won't be able to talk. But it's still me talking. I'm the whole thing. It's the whole deal. So this idea that it was my brain, not me, no. That is you doing it, for heaven's sake. And now the conscious awareness, the conscious reflection, and I'm not even consciously reflecting on much of what I'm saying. It's just coming out of my mouth, and hopefully it makes sense to you. But I'm not sort of, why did I say? I don't know. It's just happening. Look here, it's coming out. And actually, now I'm trying to think about it. I'm finding it. Where is this sentence going to go? You see, I'm just breaking down.
Right.
So, being in the moment, being spontaneous. this is really being you. It's when you try and second guess yourself and thinking, oh, what should I say that? This is when it breaks down and it's not you. At the most, when we're most in the moment, when we're most with someone we love or doing something we love, we're not consciously reflecting. We are just doing it. We're just being it. That is us. That is you. And so in a way, that is why the implicit you sometimes is that. Well, that is the real you, and that's why you want to shape it in the right direction. Okay, so is our conscious interpretation always wrong? No, I don't. Often we know why we're doing things. Why am I saying these words? Because I'm trying to answer your question. There could be some strange other reason why I'm saying them, but no, I think I'm just trying to answer you. I'm probably right about that. You can devise situations, experimental situations, where you can induce people to do things because of some subliminal stimulus that they're not aware of, and you can manipulate people in this way. But yeah, okay. Somewhat, people are not perfect, but most of the time I think we have a pretty. But this again is about the extent to which the sort of metacognition reflects the implicit cognition. And like Juliet, she probably would think when she gives the black student a lower mark than the white student, she probably thinks, yes, I did that because it was the fair mark to give. It wasn't as good an essay. Which is wrong. It's not what. Right. And if she attended a little more closely to what. It's a rationalization of something that's of a bias. This is this peculiar thing again about being human, that we have this conscious level, this level of self-reflection seems to be really us, and we kind of think that if the brain did it before this sort of conscious stuff kicked in, then it wasn't really me. And in a sense, this conscious stuff is me. That's the me I want to be. That's the ideal I'm setting myself. That's where I want to be. But it doesn't mean I'm always there. And I'm everything else as well. I'm all the whole mass of habits and bad habits and everything. That's all me too. And it's this duality, I think, in us that is, as I say, both the curse and the blessing of being human. We're animals who are aware of our own animal nature and are trying to control it and understand it. And that's a funny thing to be.
Yeah. And that's
why we have religion.
Oh, pardon. But yeah, I'm in full agreement with you. For example, say I had a bad mood, right? And something occurs. Leon talked over me or something like that, and all of a sudden now I'm angry, and then I'll rationalize, it's because Leon talked over me that I'm angry. But perhaps I'm in a bad mood due to something else, perhaps some sort of chemical imbalance or something else that happened prior. And then this event that because I had this filter of anger and this event that that occurred with you, it's not necessarily true, this rationalization. I would say the rationalization is actually the most false thing of all. If anything, it's that feeling that I have is true, but necessarily assigning it to you would not be true.
So it would be like displaced anger?
Yeah, that's one example. Say I had a stomach ache, and all of a sudden I feel, okay, the stomach ache is because of this particular food that I ate before. But I could be wrong. Could be something else.
Could be anxiety.
I don't know if that's it could be anxiety. There you go. There you go. Thank you for saying that.
You're welcome. Yeah. So we kind of make these quick interpretations, right? I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right, and then we're so a lot of times very certain of our interpretations. And just by the way, as a quick aside, this is the sort of flaw with psychoanalytic thought and just psychoanalysis as a whole as an endeavor. So a lot of times what happens with therapy is that the therapist is sort of married to their interpretation of what the problem is. And so what happens is a lot of times we're actually either wrong or it's more nuanced than we think. So we have this great explanation that sounds super logical and sounds incredibly reasonable, but it's either one of the reasons that's causing the problem or it's not the reason at all. So we have to really be careful of something making sense but not actually being true, or rather accepting something that makes sense but is not actually true.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are terrific rationalizers, and indeed. Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber have argued quite persuasively, I think, that the function of the human reasoning system is to rationalize your beliefs. It's to win arguments with people. That's what it's for. It's we give information to other people. We tell them things. Now, it's very important that people can evaluate what we've told them. Am I giving reliable information? And so for me to be treated as a reliable communicator, I need to be able to explain why that's true. I need to be able to provide reasons for it. Mm-hmm. So it is that human reasoning is the prime function of it is to provide reasons for things you believe, mm-hmm. so that people can assess how far they should trust them. It's not to criticize what you believe. It's not to examine its truth. It's to defend it. And we are extraordinarily good at doing this. And one consequence of this, I think, is that we tend, as we provide reasons for the things we believe, we tend to then reinforce those beliefs to make them stronger, again, at the implicit level, because the more reasons you have for something, the more you should believe it. So the more the habit becomes ingrained. And the danger is then that, I think this sometimes happens when you get in a debate with someone, particularly, say an opponent. What you're actually doing, say on social media, on Twitter or whatever, mm-hmm. you get in a debate with them. What you're actually doing is prompting them to think up more reasons to believe what they already believe.
Interesting.
And thereby entrenching that belief. As it were, you're giving them a sort of mental workout. They say, what do you believe? And they say, I believe this. Now, maybe that was just like an off-the-cuff thing, and they weren't really all that committed to it. But you say, oh, you can't believe that. That's terrible. They say, well, yes, I can, because... And they start listing reasons. And and as they list these reasons, they get more convinced it's true. Mm-hmm. So you're actually driving them into a stronger commitment to that view than they had before. And so, I mean, maybe... I do worry that sometimes debate just serves as a workout for your opponent's, a mental workout for your opponent, rather than having any effect on making them reflect. I don't think people reflect very well when they're challenged. And again, what you were saying there about therapists, I expect that if you are in a position where your diagnosis or interpretation is being treated as authoritative, you want to make sure it seems authoritative, so you find authoritative. So you think up reasons for it. You're the expert. You should have reasons for it. So you start, coming up with them. And it's possible to find reasons for anything, and thereby making your commitment to it stronger, making it more ingrained. Yeah. So I guess the moral of that is we all need to be less sure of ourselves, and I think our style of debate. We have this kind of sort of like forensic style of debate where we challenge each other or whatever, and we're expected to state our case and defend our case and be firm in our views and not be tentative and exploratory. I think that's bad. I think we're encouraging bad habits.
And Keith, I think our final question, which might be pretty much our most important one, I think for the show, especially a good capstone, it would be according to your research in terms of your research in implicit and explicit bias. What do you find are the reasons why? I guess it has to be multiple. I think. What are sort of some of the major reasons or the reasons why people find it so difficult to change their belief systems?
Oh gosh, I think you.
Or rather to examine them. Let me just say examine them, not to make it so complicated. So how come they find it so hard to examine?
First of all, a lot of these belief systems are... I think you need to look at... There are many reasons. First of all, you need to look at why the beliefs have been formed. I think certain belief systems are socially... not necessarily imposed, but they are. Belief is a way of defining a community. Communities are often defined by the things they believe, and wanting to fit in with your community is an extremely important thing. And so maybe one way to get people to question or affect beliefs is to take them out of the community into another community where there's a different set of beliefs and standards, a different set of standards and beliefs. If you're in an environment where everybody else believes something, it's very hard for you not to believe it, because you just want to fit in. Another reason is, I think, that our belief-forming systems are, they're kind of inductive. They extrapolate from the evidence you've been presented with. Now, if you've been in a certain if you have very limited experience of people of a different group or a different ethnic group or whatever it might be, and if your experience of them has been very limited, you might extrapolate on the basis of that very limited experience to the whole group.
Yep.
And you need more experience to form a fairer belief. So these are not. So what I'm saying is it's the environment. Yep. It's both the social and the wider the environment you've been exposed to. And the one reason I think these are hard to change is that beliefs are these kind of implicit. These are the basic mechanisms by which you function in the world. They're the things that get you around. Like I was saying, when you're driving the car, you know where the controls are. That's how you drive the car. Your beliefs about. And if you get in a different car where the controls are different, it's very difficult to do it because you need to have robust habits for getting around the world. There may be bad habits, but they're the habits that get you through the day, as it were. And these are hard to change. These are the sort of default settings that you have. And it's very important, I think, that these should be fairly consistent because you don't want to be, if you're in a certain community where everybody believes it, you don't want to be waking up each day and having different set of attitudes each day, changing your mind continually. You won't fit in. People won't find you reliable. They won't know how to, what to expect of you. They will be disappointed in you. They'll be angry with you. You need to sort of get the settings right for the environment you're in. And this, I guess what I'm sketching there is a sort of evolutionary kind of perspective on this. The evolutionists, equipped us with a bunch of sort of belief-forming systems that form beliefs that work in the setting you're in. And so changing that setting is probably the best way. And giving people incentives to realize that this bunch of default attitudes they have are not the only ones that are possible, and in fact probably not good ones, especially if you get in a wider community.
Right. So beliefs are adaptive.
Absolutely. I think so. I mean, I think the belief-forming mechanisms are adaptive. I'm not saying that individual beliefs are adaptive, but the mechanisms, nature's trying to equip you with a bunch of beliefs that will allow you to get by. And if you're in a community where everybody believes in a certain thing, it's adaptive to go along with it. Otherwise, you're going to have to fight all the time. You're going to be continually, having confrontations. One reason I say this isn't to excuse it, but it's to understand that our minds are kind of not transparent and not completely under our own control. We have to. This is the thing about self-shaping. It's hard to change your outlook, and you need to work at it, and you need to be motivated to do it and inspired to do it. Indeed, and it's a process that's going to take time, and that's both a little bit discouraging, but also positive, I think, because if you understand that it's a challenging process, it's like, say, losing weight or anything else. You've got to work at it. If you understand that it's going to take time, then you won't be discouraged if you find that you're slipping back occasionally and it's not as easy as you thought.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, of course, it's a process of trial and error, and for anyone listening, not to be discouraged if there's any sort of failure, because it's a process that other people have undertaken before and been able to make changes. And when you see that other people were able to make changes as well, you can sort of have a sort of faith that can happen with you as well, even if there's a failure here and then. Even with many things that I try to do nowadays, like I try to read more, like at least an hour a day, at least nowadays. It used to be much less than that, the frequency. And so there's sometimes I fail, and then there's other times where I succeed, and more often than not, I do succeed in reading. And so I'm not discouraged the times that I don't. I have faith that I'm going to attempt this again, and then perhaps even excel to another level with that. And then other endeavors as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So, Alan?
Keith, there's this new thing that we're doing. Leon's not aware that I'm about to ask this question. I wanted to ask if there was, let's say, a message that you wanted to pass on, let's say, to the world, something that something that you wish that everyone knew, for instance. what would you like that to be? And no pressure. We can always adjust that question. Yeah.
Oh gosh, there are the obvious things that everyone knows, that that life is short and that it's strange, it's bizarre, it's weird, and the only way to get through it is by helping each other. I mean, that's the thing that I've learned. Life is incredibly short, and it's love and cooperation and human contact that makes any sense of it at all. More specifically, I would say, try to understand, that's just a sort of general, but more specifically, I'd say try to understand what kind of a thing you are. Try to understand how your mind works. Try to understand how your brain works. Our vision of ourselves, the vision that we have kind of introspectively, if you like, this kind of idea we have of ourselves, it's kind of made up. It's not the reality. There is a lot more to you than the way you envision yourself, for positive or negative. There's a lot more stuff going on. You have more control than you think in some directions and less control than you think in other directions. And when you understand this, understand exactly who you are and what you are, you have a better idea, I think. You are fairer to yourself, for one thing. You don't necessarily expect so much from yourself, and you understand the ways in which you can be better. And in trying to be better, don't just look at yourself, look at other people, look at the people who inspire you, look at the people you love, look at the people who you want to be better for, and let them help you.
Yeah.
Wow.
You can't do it all yourself.
Absolutely, I love that.
Wow.
All right, Keith, thank you so much for coming on today. What an insightful show.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, I hope so.
Most definitely.
No, of course.
And so, Keith, if we wanted to find you or your work, where can we find you online?
You can find my website. It's keithfrankish.com. Just one word, KeithFrankish.com. And there's various stuff on there. There's reprints of some of my articles, even some bits of even a few limericks on there. So, yeah.
And if we wanted to find you on social media, where would that be?
The best place to find me is Twitter, because I'm always tweeting.
Yeah.
It's basically what I do when I should be doing something else is I go on Twitter and I joke or ask questions. So you can find me it's just at Keith Frankish, one word.
Excellent.
And no, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me again. It's a great pleasure talking to you both.
I was very happy with this episode. Thank you so much.
I like what you're doing with this podcast. I think you're doing a great thing. I've listened to one or two of the other episodes, and I think you're doing a good thing. And I wish you the very best with this. I think it's a great initiative, and you're having a great effect. And keep it up and do more of it.
Thank you so much, Keith. So much.
Please come on again and be well. See you next time.
Yeah.
All right, guys, that was cool. That was an awesome episode. By the way, behind the scenes, we had some camera issues before we started, but we'll have that fixed next time. If anything, guys, follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Yep. Remember to subscribe.
Hit the bell.
And
on YouTube.
On YouTube.
We'll see you guys next week.
See you next week.